in the winter of 1891, under a sky weighed down by snow and silence, 9-year-old Elias Greaves arrived at Bellwick Orphanage, a towering soot-brick monolith hidden deep in the pines of rural Vermont, where the wind howled like it had learned to grieve. The carriage that brought him from the county poorhouse creaked and moaned as if reluctant to approach, and even the horse, pale-eyed and shivering, seemed eager to flee the moment Elias stepped down onto the frozen gravel path. Bellwick loomed before him, tall iron gates curling like black vines, its stone walls covered in creeping moss that curled like fingers around shattered windowsills. The roof was pitched like a crown of jagged teeth, chimneys coughing out thin streams of gray smoke, and its windows, at least those not broken or bricked up, held no light, only shadows watching from within. He clutched his tiny suitcase, filled with nothing but a pair of worn shoes, a charred book of Psalms, and the smell of ash that still clung to his clothes from the fire that had taken everything: his parents, his voice, and his sense of the world as a place where love once lived. His throat had closed up that night, not from smoke, but from horror, and it had remained closed ever since, a voice box locked by memory. The iron gates groaned open, and waiting inside the archway was a tall, angular woman wrapped in what looked like layers of Victorian mourning cloth, with a hat adorned not with flowers but faded feathers that might have once belonged to a raven. "Elias Greaves," she said without a trace of emotion. "You'll find no need to speak here. Most forget how eventually." She handed him a small, leather-bound booklet with gold-trimmed pages and a velvet ribbon. His name, Elias Greaves, was inked on the first page in harsh, angular lettering. "You'll read this daily. Read your name often. You'll forget the rest soon enough." Her voice sounded like dried parchment being crumpled. She led him through doors so tall and heavy it took 2 porters in brown uniforms to heave them open. Inside, the air was neither warm nor cold, just still, as if movement itself had been extinguished. The grand entrance hall was lined with dozens of grandfather clocks, all ticking at different rhythms, some fast, others slow, but none correct. Their dissonant ticking created a maddening metronome that made Elias's skin itch. A single painting hung on the wall, a large oil portrait of a faceless child in Victorian dress, their hands clasped in prayer, and beneath it a plaque that read, "The name is the anchor." As Miss Halpern led Elias down the echoing corridor, he noticed that the walls were covered not in wallpaper or stone, but in names. Thousands of names etched in delicate, spidery script. Emmeline Ward, Thomas Vale, Levi Crowther, Matilda Lorne, Benedict Shaw, Eleanor Crisp, and so on, stretching from floor to ceiling, as though the walls themselves were held up by memory. The dormitory was immaculate, rows of neatly made beds with white iron frames and footlockers at the base, each with a child's name engraved into the brass. The children were equally immaculate, perfectly combed hair, polished shoes, pale skin, and clothes without a speck of dust. Yet their eyes were blank, their smiles mechanical, as if someone had told them how to smile, but never why. When Elias passed them, they turned their heads in eerie unison, their gaze following him like a pendulum swing. He raised a hand in a tentative wave, but none waved back. One girl, her hair in pristine braids, whispered her name like a catechism. "Lillian Grace." Lillian Grace, Lillian Grace, over and over again as he unfolded sheets in perfect triangles. In the dining hall, Elias was given a tray of food, beef stew, bread, and a slice of apple. But when he took a bite, the stew tasted like chalk, the bread like air, and the apple like paper. The children ate silently, not because of rules, but because none of them seemed to feel hunger. At night, each child knelt beside their bed and recited their name in a monotone chant. Elias watched, disturbed, as they repeated their identities over and over like monks in a trance. Margaret Quinn, Margaret Quinn, Margaret Quinn. Harold Vale, Harold Vale, Harold Vale. The lights dimmed without flicker, and the room fell into a breathless silence. Elias did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling and repeated his name in his mind, not because he wanted to, but because he felt if he didn't, something would take it from him. The next morning, Elias tried to speak to a boy near his age. He pointed to a window and mimed birds flying. The boy stared for a moment, then whispered, "I don't remember birds." When Elias drew a sun with his finger on the dusty desk, the boy flinched as though burned. "Don't draw things that aren't here," he said. "They make it worse." Elias tried again with another child, a freckled girl who was humming softly. But when he tapped her shoulder, she turned and smiled so hard it looked painful, then said, "Sarah Goodwin," and nothing more, as if that was all she could offer. Over the next week, Elias noticed more. How the rooms were always cleaned by unseen hands. How every book in the library was blank except for the first page, where the name of a child was printed. How the mirror in the washroom did not reflect faces, only silhouettes. And how every clock, no matter how broken, never stopped ticking. One afternoon, he wandered down a hallway that twisted at unnatural angles. At the end, he found a room filled with music boxes, each playing a slightly different tune. There were hundreds, stacked on shelves, and in the center stood a pedestal with a single, cracked porcelain mask resting upon it. A tag beside it read, "Name unknown. Face lost." Lag. HTHS above flickered. Elias backed away. That night, as snow fell and blanketed the orphanage in silence, Elias had a dream. He stood before a mirror, but his face was smeared, melting like whey. He could hear the whispers of children behind him, reciting names in a choir of despair. He tried to scream, but nothing came. He tried to remember his mother's lullaby, his father's voice, the feel of their hands, but all that came was the sound of ticking. When he awoke, his hands were gripping the booklet Miss Halpern had given him. The page with his name was open, but the ink had started to fade. The next day, he was called into Miss Halpern's office. Her desk was covered in dried petals and rusted keys. She looked at him without blinking and said, "You must read your name more frequently. If you lose it, you'll become one of them." She gestured to the wall behind her, lined with porcelain masks. The mask does not come when the face disappears. It comes when the name is forgotten. Without your name, you are unanchored. Elias nodded mutely, heart thudding like one of the cursed clocks. That evening, he clutched the booklet tightly under his blanket and traced the letters of his name with his finger, mouthing it over and over. Elias Greaves. Elias Greaves. Elias Greaves. The wind outside howled like wolves mourning the lost. Somewhere in the dark, a music box played by itself, and in the hallway, the ticking of clocks was joined by the soft sound of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone living. It was only 3 weeks into his silent stay at Bellwick Orphanage that Elias Greaves began to notice the irregular thinning of the children. How some would simply vanish overnight, their beds perfectly made in the morning, their names removed from the brass tags on their footlockers, and how no one ever spoke of them again. Not a whisper, not a memory. Even the children who once sat beside them would glance through the missing space as if nothing had ever filled it. Elias first noticed it when a boy named Thomas Vale, who shared his whispered name with a trembling voice and who once showed Elias how to fold paper birds during chore hour, didn't come down to breakfast one morning. His plate remained untouched. The stew, which always steamed in sterile, tasteless fashion, grew cold. Elias looked toward the spot where Thomas usually sat, but the others didn't even blink at the empty chair. The next night, Elias stayed up long after curfew, listening to the ambient pulse of the clocks echo through the stone bones of the building. Around 2 a.m, just as the snow began tapping at the lead glass windows, he heard it for the first time. Faint, rhythmic chanting coming from deep within the walls. Names, spoken with a mechanical cadence. Emmeline Ward, Levi Crowther, Thomas Vale, over and over again in that dry, whispering voice, like wind through a cracked grave. The sound didn't come from the dormitory. It came from deeper within the orphanage, from behind the east wing, where children were never allowed. The hallway to Wing C was always locked with a heavy rusted bolt, and the copper-plated door bore no handle, only a dull brass plate etched with the words, "The remembered are sealed." The door had a warped, ancient quality, as though it had belonged to another century, another building altogether, and it smelled faintly of mildew, ash, and iron. For the next several nights, Elias would listen as the names echoed through the floorboards, always after midnight, always accompanied by the scent of burnt oil and the flickering of faint candlelight spilling beneath that copper door. He asked Miss Halpern once, mustering enough courage to scribble on a paper slate, "Where is Thomas?" She looked at him for a long moment before responding, "He has graduated." But Elias knew there were no adoptions at Bellwick. No carriages ever arrived, no letters, no photos. Graduation, it seemed, was not an escape. It was a disappearance. The mystery deepened when Elias encountered a boy he hadn't seen before. Orrin was older, perhaps 12 or 13, thin as a fence post, with hollow cheeks and sharp, alert eyes that looked too knowing to belong to a child. His sleeves were always rolled tightly to the elbow, and his knuckles were wrapped in worn gauze, as if he'd been in fights he never spoke of. Orrin didn't smile. He didn't chant his name at bedtime like the others. And more importantly, he didn't stare at Elias with that blank, porcelain-like detachment the others carried like a disease. They met in the cellar, where Elias had wandered by accident after following a trail of spilled flour. Orrin was crouched over a floorboard, prying it open with a rusted spoon. "Don't look at the walls too long," Orrin said quietly without turning. "They'll take more than your attention." Elias tilted his head, confused. Orrin looked up, eyes narrowing. "You're still real," he said, as if studying an animal on the verge of extinction. "You still ask questions. That's rare here." Over the next few days, they met in secret. Elias, though voiceless, managed to communicate with scribbles, gestures, and shared silence. Oren began to speak of things no one else dared acknowledge. He talked of the forbidden wing sea, and the name ritual, a term he whispered like a curse. They chant your name to anchor you, Oren said. It's not prayer, it's preservation. If you stop saying it, you start to slip. Not just your memories, your face, but too. It melts into nothing, and the mask, it finds you. Elias's eyes widened. He thought of Lillian Grace, who once blinked out during a meal, and when she reappeared days later, her movements were stiff, her smile cracked, and her face, although perfectly symmetrical, looked subtly wrong, like it had been sculpted by someone who had never seen a child up close. Oren explained how he'd discovered the truth. The servant tunnels. Forgotten by the staff, buried beneath the first blueprints, the tunnels had allowed him to observe Wing C through a fractured tile that led to a narrow viewing slit in the wall. They think we're too stupid or broken to look, Oren muttered, but if you watch long enough, you see how they do it. One night, wrapped in their wool blankets and moving like ghosts, Elias followed Oren through the laundry chute and into a crawl space beneath the west wing. The air was thick with mold, and the passage seemed alive. Walls pulsing with the weight of time. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and soon they arrived at the cracked stone tile. Oren's spy hole. What Elias saw nearly broke him. A dozen children stood in a perfect circle around a black mirror, so dark it seemed to drink the light around it. They were stripped of individuality, clothed in identical white robes, barefoot, heads lowered. A tall figure dressed in crimson vestments, neither male nor female, face hidden behind an ivory mask shaped like a smiling sun, walked slowly among them, holding a blank porcelain face in gloved hands. One by one the children stepped forward, speaking their names in dull, resigned tones. Margaret Quinn, Elias Palmer, Oren Luthien, and when they finished, the red-robed figure would press the mask over their face, murmuring in a tongue that made Elias's blood run cold. D. Each time the mask touched skin, the child's body shivered, stiffened, and then fell into a death-like stillness. When they looked up, their faces were smoothed, devoid of age, expression, identity, waxen and hollow. But they continued to chant their names as though the voice remembered what the body had lost. Elias felt sick. He looked at Oren, whose jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. "They keep the name," Oren whispered, "because it's the only thing the mask can hold on to. If you lose that, you disappear entirely. You become one of the faceless. There's no getting back from that." They watched in stunned silence as a small girl, perhaps only 6, hesitated during the ritual, stuttering on her name. The robed figure paused, waiting. But when she failed to continue, her mouth opened in a silent scream. Her skin melted like candle wax, her eyes turning to shadow, her body folding in on itself like parchment. The mirror absorbed her reflection completely. Nothing remained. No mask, no name, just a sudden absence. A gap in the ritual. The others didn't react. The chanting resumed. Elias shook as he backed away from the viewing slit, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't cried since the fire. But this was worse. This wasn't death. It was erasure. Orrin grabbed his arm and led him back through the tunnels. They didn't speak until they reached the safety of the cellar. "They told us memory is dangerous," Orrin said. "But it's not. It's what protects you. This place, it eats your past and replaces it with obedience. The mask isn't a punishment. It's a container. It holds what's left when everything else is stolen." Elias stared at the floor, gripping the little booklet tighter than ever. His name was fading faster now, the ink smudged, the paper torn. "You mustn't let it go," Orrin said. "Your name is your last defense." For the next week, Elias said his name, me constantly, mouthing it while sweeping, tracing it with his finger on frost-covered windows, and scratching it onto loose scraps of cloth. Orrin taught him how to rewrite it using candle soot and water. "The ink here fades on purpose," he explained. "The walls leach it away." As more children disappeared, their names echoing through the orphanage like lingering ghosts, Elias and Orrin plotted. There had to be a way out, but escape wouldn't be easy. Wing C was not just a place. It was a ritual engine, feeding on identity, burning childhood into fuel for whatever ancient practice the red-robed figure was performing. "They're not just erasing us," Orrin said. "They're preserving something for themselves. I think—" But he stopped, because that night the chanting grew louder. The masks were multiplying, and Elias saw in the distorted mirror of the washroom that his own face was beginning to blur at the edges. In the dimmest corner of Bellwick's endless shadow, beneath rusted pipes and forgotten stairwells, Orrin took Elias by the hand and whispered, "I found where they keep the faces." The sentence, carried in a breath barely stronger than the creaking of old floorboards, hung between them like a spell. After everything Elias had seen, masks sealed onto children's skin, names spoken like lifelines, eyes gone hollow, he had believed nothing could deepen his dread. But those words did. And the way Orrin said them, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted certainty, suggested this was not mere rumor or nightmare logic, but truth, raw, festering, and hidden just beneath their feet. That night, as snow lashed against the orphanage walls and the grandfather clocks ticked with that maddening, discordant rhythm, Elias followed Orrin into the forbidden corridors that twisted beneath the dining hall. They moved silently past the sleeping dormitories, where children murmured their names in restless, fractured dreams, their mouths moving, as if afraid to be forgotten even in sleep. Orrin led him through a cracked pantry floorbow, hard, behind a shelf of unmarked jars filled with gray pickled roots, down a crawlspace so narrow Elias had to turn sideways to breathe. The air stank of old vinegar and damp limestone, and the deeper they went, the colder it became. Not the cold of weather, but the cold of deep places untouched by sun or memory. Finally, they emerged into a stone chamber unlike any Elias had seen. It was lit by a single oil lamp, its flame flickering weakly beneath a soot-blackened glass dome, and even its trembling light revealed only part of the room. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were lined with jars, hundreds of them, each filled with a translucent blue fluid, each containing a floating pale replica of a human face. Perfect, preserved, expressionless. Some were small, soft with youth. Others more mature, as if taken mid-childhood. Each jar bore a number engraved in copper. No names, no initials, just numbers. Orrin stepped forward and "This is the vault. This is where they store what they steal." Elias's knees weakened, and he braced himself against the wall. He walked slowly along the rows, scanning the faces. The fluid glistened, the skin inside eerily smooth, like marble submerged in ice. Some eyes were open, others closed, but all looked absent, not dead, just detached. Then Orrin stopped abruptly. "Look," he said, pointing to a jar near the center of the third shelf. Elias stepped closer and read the number. Number 137. He stared into the jar and gasped. Inside was a face he knew intimately. His own. His eyes, his nose, the faint scar above his brow from when he fell from a horse at age 5. But the most terrible part was the emptiness in the expression. It was his face, but drained of everything he believed made him himself, as if someone had peeled the outer shell of his being and stored it here like a relic. "That's how you know they're not destroying you," Orrin whispered. "They're collecting us. For what? I don't know. Power? Maybe. Worship. Control. But each time they take a name, they preserve the face. Not as memory, but as inventory." Elias couldn't look away. He pressed his hand against the cold glass of the jar and felt something sharp in his chest, as if part of him had truly been removed and left behind here like a library book returned. "Why don't they label them with names?" he mouthed silently, and Orrin answered, "Because names are dangerous. Names are anchors. If someone spoke your name to this face, I think it might remember." That thought made Elias stumble backward. But Orrin wasn't done. He reached into his coat and pulled out something old and yellowed, a blueprint, brittle at the corners and marked in rust. "I found this behind the chapel altar," he said. "It's from the original builders of Bellwick. There's something they buried, a 5th tunnel that leads out under the forest, all the way to an abandoned railway depot. But it was sealed before the orphanage opened, bricked shut." Elias studied the drawing and saw the faint line, drawn in pencil, moving beneath the chapel and disappearing into a thick block of bricks. The shaft was narrow but navigable, and if it still existed, it might be their only chance to escape this ritual machine. Orrin's eyes burned with a ferocity Elias had never seen in anyone at Bellwick. "We can't go alone," he said. "There's someone else, Matilda Lorne. She's starting to forget, she's on the edge, but she still remembers her name. For now." That evening, as thunder growled across the sky and lightning split the pine woods in crooked veins, Elias and Orrin passed notes folded into paper cranes and slipped them beneath Matilda's bedframe. She was 12, with hair like silken coal and a voice so soft it barely disturbed the air. She had once sung in the dining hall, lullabies she claimed her mother taught her, and she still clutched a piece of lace sewn into her sleeve, the last fragment of her former life. When she met them and together they moved forward through the tunnel. Behind them, faint and growing fainter, the voices from Bellwick continued to chant. Names. Names without faces. Names without futures. But the trio kept going, deeper into the stone, toward whatever waited at the end of the tunnel. Because now they understood. Escape would not be a matter of running. It would be a matter of remembering, of keeping names alive, of holding on to the last fragments of who they were before Bellwick decided to make them hollow. And somewhere ahead, they hoped, prayed, they would find not just freedom, but a place where their faces belonged to them once again. They crawled for what felt like hours, inching forward in suffocating silence, the tunnel beneath Bellwick narrowing and descending, the air heavy with centuries of undisturbed decay, as if even time had held its breath beneath the old world, afraid of what might still dwell within the stone. Elias led, one hand gripping the soot-stained booklet containing his fading name, the other pressed against cold brick, while Matilda followed closely behind, lips murmuring her identity like a prayer against madness, and Orrin brought up the rear, lantern dim and flickering, eyes scanning the darkness for signs of movement, or worse, memory. The further they went, the stranger the walls became, etched with shallow carvings too crude to be writing, symbols that looked like attempts at faces, drawn by hands that had forgotten what faces were, and at intervals, bones. Child-sized femurs resting in clusters, rib cages fused into the rock, like offerings to something hungry and unsatisfied, and skulls that bore no mouths. It was Matilda who first noticed the whispering, soft, melodic, and oddly synchronized with their footfalls, and she froze, eyes wide, whispering, "It's the names." For the whispers weren't voices, but fragments of identities long lost, drift. Elias stood transfixed, watching the fire consume the spires, the chapel bell crashing through the roof and tolling once, twice, before falling silent forever, and Matilda pressed the lace from her sleeve to her lips, whispering thanks for every child who would no longer be bound to a name they didn't remember. Dawn came slow, the first light revealing what had been hidden for over 50 years. The woods around Bellwick were filled with stones marked only with numbers, dozens, maybe hundreds, arranged in a spiral pattern that centered around the ruins, silent witnesses to a ritual so old and so quiet that even God had looked away. The authorities came 2 days later, drawn by the fire, the smoke, and the strange silence, but found no records, no bodies, no official mention of the children who had lived and vanished there. Only ashes and stone, a wall blackened by heat, and on it, carved deeply as if by hundreds of tiny hands, a list of names, 143 in total, each etched with perfect care, each name now free from the mask it once anchored. Elias and Matilda were taken in by a distant cousin of hers in Concord, and though they never spoke of what they'd seen to anyone outside their circle, Elias wrote the names down, each one, by hand, every year on the anniversary of the fire, in a leather-bound book he kept under his floorboards, and when he grew older and stronger, he traveled the Northeast, searching antique stores and estate auctions, not for riches but for danger, for jars, masks, or mirrors. He found 6, burned 5, and buried 1 in a salt ring at the base of a hollow tree. He never married, never had children, never stopped speaking his name at least once a day. Matilda lived quietly, never far from Elias, and though her face aged, her voice never did. Always soft, always steady, as though it had learned to survive despite the world. They kept the story hidden, not Becky,